At dawn on the 15th of May, 1979, a young Air Force pilot by the name of John Rawlings stormed Ghana's military barracks with a pistol and a handful of loyal men. His mission? Overthrow the corrupt regime bleeding the country dry. It failed. He was captured, dragged before a military tribunal, and sentenced to death. But instead of begging for mercy, Rawlings stunned the court and the nation. He took full responsibility for the coup, demanded his fellow soldiers be spared, and delivered a fiery speech that echoed through every market, barracks, and radio set in Ghana. 3 weeks later, on June 4, 1979, junior soldiers who'd heard that speech broke him out of jail. By sunrise, Rawlings was on national radio. By sunset, he was head of state. But who was this fearless young man? Where did he come from? And what shaped his obsession with justice? John Rawlings was born in Accra on June 22, 1947, to an Ewe mother from Ghana's Volta region and a Scottish father. His father, a chemist from Castle Douglas in Scotland, did not stay with the family and returned to the UK when Rawlings was a boy. Raised by his mother, young Rawlings attended the prestigious Achimota School in Accra, an elite institution that educated many of West Africa's future leaders. In 1968, he enrolled in the Ghana Air Force, pursuing his childhood dream of becoming a pilot. Rawlings proved to be a natural aviator. Upon graduating from flight training in 1969, he won the coveted Speedbird Trophy as the best cadet, noted for his exceptional skill in aerobatics. He was commissioned as a pilot officer and steadily rose through the ranks, reaching the rank of flight lieutenant by 1978. As a young officer, Rawlings developed a reputation for passion and integrity. He grew increasingly disillusioned with the corruption and privilege he observed among Ghana's ruling elites amid nationwide hardship at the time. You see, in the 1970s, Ghana was under the grip of a military dictatorship. It began with the National Redemption Council, a junta that later rebranded itself as the Supreme Military Council, the SMC. At the helm was Colonel Ignatius Kutu Achimpong, who had seized power in a 1972 coup. He ruled Ghana for about 6 years until he was overthrown by his own army commander, General Fred Akufo, in 1978. Promising to restore discipline and confidence in government, Akufo initially clung to Achimpong's unpopular idea of a union government without political parties, which further eroded public trust. Meanwhile, living conditions for ordinary Ghanaians continued to deteriorate. Inflation spiraled to unheard-of levels by 1979. Food prices were 13 times higher than in the mid-1960s, with annual inflation estimated at around 500%. Basic commodities disappeared from store shelves, and Ghanaians could now find them only through hoarding or a thriving black market, known locally as kalabule. Soon, the hardship sent fury on the streets. In the last 4 months of late 1978, around 80 strikes erupted across all sectors to protest the regime's policies. As a result, Akufo felt compelled to declare a state of emergency in November, and even fired over 1,000 striking civil servants in an attempt to quell the unrest. Subsequently, the SMC finally agreed to lift the ban on party politics in January 1979 and schedule new democratic elections meant to return the country to civilian rule by mid-1979. But for many Ghanaians, civilians and soldiers alike, these promises of reform were too little, too late, and something had to give.
People were hungry. Most officers could not see it, but I saw there was anger in the men's eyes.
It was in this climate that Flight Lieutenant John Rawlings, now aged 32, emerged as an unlikely champion of the people. Fortunately for him, he wasn't alone in his frustration. A coterie of junior Ghanaian officers and intellectuals held secret meetings to discuss how to cure the country's ills. Rawlings, himself, became heavily involved in the Free Africa movement, a clandestine group of Pan-Africanist military officers, organized in part by Army Major Kojo Boache John, that envisioned a series of coups to sweep away corrupt regimes and ultimately unify Africa. In late-night sessions, members read the works of revolutionary thinkers such as Marx, Mao, and Frantz Fanon, debating the legacies of colonialism and the potential for radical change. Initially, the FAM pursued a more stoic approach, whereby young officers would rise through the ranks and attempt a coordinated revolution years later when they held senior positions. But as Ghana's crisis worsened in 1979, Rawlings grew impatient.
All Boache did was talk. He was never going to act.
On the morning of Tuesday, May 15, 1979, Rawlings decided to make his move. Together with a small band of trusted soldiers, Rawlings set out to instigate an uprising within the military. In the early hours, he and his conspirators armed themselves at Accra's Air Force Base. They commandeered several armored vehicles and weapons from the base armory, swiftly overpowering the base guards and taking control of key points. Under Rawlings' lead, the rebel soldiers seized the base communication center and began arresting senior military officers who were caught off guard at that hour. Rawlings hoped this lightning action would ignite a broader revolt. According to later accounts, he had alerted a close confidant, Lieutenant Kojo Boache John, of his intentions a few days prior, in an effort to secure wider support. Boache John, feeling the timing was premature, refused to join him on the night of the coup. Unperturbed, Rawlings pushed ahead. He drove to the Army's 5th Battalion barracks in Accra, where Boache John was posted, in a bid to force his hand in the final moments and bring him into the uprising. Fatefully, Boache John was not present at the barracks when he arrived. Frustrated and running out of time, Rawlings reportedly slammed his G3 rifle to the ground in anger. Unfortunately, the loaded rifle discharged upon impact, sending bursts of gunfire cracking through the barracks. The sudden shots shattered any hope of maintaining secrecy. Soldiers awoke in alarm, confusion spread, and the element of surprise was lost. At the same time, Rawlings' ragtag coup team was facing other setbacks. They had seized a small Ferret Scout armored car as part of their plan to secure strategic locations. But the driver of the Ferret had not even been briefed on the true mission. Sensing the chaos after the accidental gunshots, the driver realized something was amiss and deliberately steered the armored car into a ditch, immobilizing one of the rebels' key assets. The coup attempt was rapidly losing momentum, and Rawlings had no other choice but to pull back to the Air Force Station, where he and a few loyal airmen lay low as daylight broke. Subsequently, loyal military units quickly organized to quash the mutiny. The 5th Battalion, once it recovered from the initial confusion, mustered troops to counterattack the rebels. A detachment of soldiers from the 5th Infantry and the Reconnaissance Regiment, led by Major Seydou Mahama, was dispatched to hunt down Rawlings. They tracked him to the Air Force Station where he had taken refuge. Outnumbered and outgunned, Rawlings was cornered and arrested that same morning. The arrest itself became the stuff of legend. It is said that Major Mahama personally seized Rawlings' pistol, struck the young officer with it, and reprimanded him.
You don't stage coups with a pistol.
The military government wasted no time making an example of the coup plotters. Rawlings and his 6 accomplices were charged with treason and mutiny, grave offenses that carried the death penalty. General Akufo's regime, eager to deter any further dissent in the ranks ahead of the looming elections, decided to stage a public court-martial to punish the ringleaders. Rawlings' trial opened in late May 1979 under intense public scrutiny. The proceedings took place at the Burma Hall in Accra's military barracks, a venue large enough to accommodate the crowds that gathered to witness the spectacle. You see, the court-martial was open to the public, and thousands of ordinary Ghanaians flooded into the hall, cramming the galleries to get a glimpse of the rebellious flight lieutenant on the dock. As the trial commenced, Rawlings and the other accused were brought before the panel of military judges. Immediately, the flight lieutenant set the tone defiantly. When asked by the tribunal whether he wished to be tried separately from his subordinates, Rawlings refused any special treatment.
I want to be with my men,
he declared, a simple statement that electrified the courtroom and drew wild applause from the crowd. What truly shook the proceedings, however, was Rawlings' own testimony. Rather than pleading for mercy or denying the charges, Rawlings seized the courtroom as a platform to deliver a searing indictment of the very regime trying him. In a speech that has since become part of Ghanaian history, the accused coup leader spoke with a mix of fury and conviction that left both the judges and spectators stunned.
Now you listen to me well and good, because I am not here to make a speech, and I am not here to waste my time talking. First and foremost, let me inform you that I am not here to impose myself on 10 million citizens of this country. But I am telling you that I am here today in the history of this country to address myself to military senior officers, all those politicians, all those businessmen and foreign criminals who have used our blood, sweat and tears, the tools of our laboring, to enrich themselves, to drown in wine and women, while the majority of us are daily struggling for survival. I am not an expert in economics, and I am not an expert in law, but I am an expert in working on an empty stomach while wondering when and where the next meal will come from. I am going to prove to you today that it is no longer a question of the military against the civilians. It is no longer a question of the Akan against the Ewe, the Ga against the Northerner, but a question of those who have against those who have not. A question of a vast majority of hungry people against a very tiny minority of greedy, inhumane, selfish senior officers, politicians, businessmen, and their bank managers. You and I are the bigger fools for allowing such a blatant abuse of human dignity for so long. 22 years after independence, you and I are still hitting our heads on the ground and leaving it all to God to save us one day. Let me tell you today that God will not help you, and the big men will not help you. Only you can help yourself.
Throughout this extraordinary oration, the court officers attempted to maintain order, but the atmosphere in Burma Hall had undergone a significant change. Many spectators were visibly moved, and bursts of applause kept breaking out despite the guards' attempts at silence. Insisting that he was solely responsible for the attempted coup, Rawlings demanded that his colleagues, charged with aiding him in the treasonable act, be set free.
Leave my men alone. I am responsible for everything.
This plea struck a chord with Ghana's lower ranks, but unsurprisingly, the military tribunal found him and the other plotters guilty of the mutiny. As a result, Rawlings was publicly sentenced to death by firing squad for treason. He was to be held in a military guardroom prison pending execution. However, if Akufo's regime expected Rawlings's conviction to frighten the public into submission, they gravely miscalculated. In fact, the opposite occurred. The trial had turned Rawlings into a popular hero. Many Ghanaians, reeling under economic injustice, heard in Rawlings's words their own simmering frustrations finally voiced on a public stage. The state-controlled media, perhaps to the regime's regret, even reported portions of Rawlings's defiant testimony, which spread rapidly through cities and villages. Rawlings languished in a military cell as May turned to June 1979, reportedly under harsh conditions. But by a twist of fate, he would not face the firing squad. Within the Ghanaian armed forces, especially among young officers and enlisted men, Rawlings's impact was profound. For those soldiers, Rawlings had articulated exactly what they felt, that a corrupt clique of big men had betrayed the ideals of the military and impoverished the nation. Among Rawlings's co-conspirators, Lieutenant Kojo Boache John emerged as a key planner for the next steps. Boache John, who had narrowly avoided being roped into the May 15th coup, felt both admiration and frustration with Rawlings's lone wolf action. However, he and others in the Free Africa movement decided that Rawlings's trial and death sentence forced their hand. They would have to fast forward their revolutionary timeline and strike now, rather than see their comrade executed. Quietly, Boache John and a handful of sympathetic officers began contacting trusted soldiers across units to coordinate a rescue plan. At the Army's 5th Battalion, the same unit Rawlings had attempted to win over, junior officers like Lieutenant Achamfuor began to quietly mobilize loyal men for action. They were soon joined by several disgruntled NCOs and soldiers. Names such as Corporal Peter Tassiri and Corporal Sarkodie Addo, among others, would later be recognized as being among the frontline conspirators. Meanwhile, the Akufo government grew increasingly uneasy about Rawlings's influence even behind bars. There were reports that leaflets with Rawlings's quotes were being clandestinely distributed in the capital, and the regime's intelligence warned of subversive conversations among junior soldiers. Yet Akufo's administration, fixated on the upcoming elections and convinced that Rawlings's supporters were mere fringe elements, was seemingly oblivious to the storm brewing in the barracks. Their official plan was to hold the first round of elections on June 18th before executing Rawlings and the other convicted mutineers once a civilian president was in place, so that the outgoing military regime wouldn't have blood directly on its hands. On Monday, June 4th, 1979, Ghana's military ranks erupted into a full-blown insurrection as small groups of rebellious soldiers moved into position in Accra. Their objective? To free Flight Lieutenant Jerry Rawlings from custody. At the Air Force Base in Accra, loyal airmen who had been part of Rawlings's failed mutiny regrouped. Simultaneously, at the barracks of the 5th Battalion, Lieutenant Achamfuor and his men armed themselves and rallied sympathetic infantry troops. Elsewhere in the city, insurgent soldiers from the Reconnaissance Regiment readied armored cars and tanks. Crucially, none of the leading conspirators informed Rawlings of what was about to happen. He remained in his cell at Base Ordnance Corps Guard Room, unaware that rescue was on the way. In the early hours, gunfire rattled through Accra's military camps once again. But this time, it signaled a much larger mutiny. Rebel soldiers swiftly overwhelmed the few guard posts still loyal to the government. At the camp guard room, Rawlings and his fellow condemned officers awoke to the sound of shooting and shouting. Suddenly, the door to Rawlings's cell was flung open by a band of armed men in battle dress, their faces sweaty and determined. For a split second, he thought this might be a trick or assassination, perhaps government agents staging an escape attempt to shoot him while fleeing. But as the intruders saluted him and yelled that they were there to get him out, Rawlings realized the unbelievable. Soldiers of the Ghanaian army were breaking him out of jail. Rawlings, still wearing a prison-issue uniform and with his boots untied, was immediately rushed to the national radio station by the triumphant soldiers. At dawn, Ghanaians tuning their radios for the morning news heard an unexpected voice crackling over the airwaves. It was Rawlings, breathless, intense, and very much alive. Grabbing the microphone, Rawlings addressed his countrymen live on air.
Here to tell you just one or two things. If any further bloodshed had to be avoided in this country, everybody might have as well realized that the ranks have borne the brunt of the suffering of this country for too long. There was bloodshed. There was bloodshed. So for heaven's sake, do not beg in their way.
Rawlings did not proclaim himself head of state or declare martial law in the usual coup-maker fashion. Instead, he was essentially giving notice that a thorough purge or house cleaning was coming. He acknowledged that the future was uncertain, but emphasized that this uprising was born from Ghana's intolerable conditions and the people's hunger for justice. All across Ghana, people stopped what they were doing to listen. When it became clear that Akufo's regime was indeed overthrown and the charismatic Rawlings was leading the charge, a wave of euphoria swept the populace. Many civilians poured onto the streets to support the uprising. They offered water and food to the rampaging soldiers and, in some cases, even joined in to point out known corrupt officials. At the broadcasting station, Rawlings concluded his announcement by letting the country know that a new Armed Forces Revolutionary Council, the AFRC, composed of a cross-section of junior ranks, would be in charge of restoring sanity and preparing the country for the scheduled elections. True to his word, the new AFRC allowed the planned elections of June 18, 1979, to go ahead on schedule. However, in the 112 days that Rawlings and the AFRC governed, they carried out drastic house-cleaning measures, including the execution of 8 top military officers for corruption, 3 of them former heads of state. It was an episode both cheered and mourned in Ghana's history. In the weeks that followed the June 4th uprising, the AFRC set up special military tribunals to try those deemed responsible for Ghana's current, horrible economic predicament. The most dramatic targets were the country's former military leaders themselves. In an extraordinary turn of events, 3 past heads of state, General Akwasi Afrifa, General Ignatius Achiampong, and General Fred Akufo, and several senior officers were hauled before panels of junior soldiers and convicted of capital offenses. They were accused of using their positions to amass wealth while in office and recklessly dissipating state funds to the detriment of the country. The AFRC made clear that anyone found guilty of stealing from the nation would face the ultimate punishment, regardless of international protests. On June 16, 1979, Ghanaians awoke to the shocking news that former head of state General Achiampong and the former Border Guards commander Major General E.K. Utuka had been executed by firing squad. Achiampong, who had led Ghana from 1972 until 1978, had been overthrown by his fellow officers in an internal coup a year prior. Yet the AFRC deemed his misdeeds grave enough that he had to face the firing squad. 10 days later, on June 26, 1979, the revolution reached its bloody crescendo. Before sunrise, 6 more senior officers were executed by firing squad in Accra, this time in a highly public spectacle. Among them were General Frederick W.K. Akufo, the very man Rawlings had ousted just 3 weeks prior, and Lieutenant General Akwasi Afrifa, a former head of state from an earlier era. They were joined in death by 4 other top commanders of the old regime: Rear Admiral Joy Amedume, the Navy Chief; Air Vice Marshal George Ya Boachie, the Air Force Chief; Major General Robert Cote, the Army Chief and one-time Chief of Defense Staff; and Colonel Roger Felly, the former Foreign Affairs Commissioner. In all, 8 men, the most senior ranks of Ghana's military establishment, had been condemned and executed. For Ghana, it was an almost unthinkable event. Never before had former heads of state been executed in public, and certainly not by their own army's junior ranks. Decades later, Rawlings admitted that some of the men executed, particularly General Afrifa, were in fact innocent and victims of a moral battle. However, he insisted he felt no regret over the executions. After the fury of June, Ghana's revolutionary summer of 1979 was surprisingly short-lived. Flight Lieutenant Rawlings had always insisted that the AFRC's rule was transitional, not a permanent regime. After 3 tumultuous months, he handed over power to an elected civilian president, Dr. Hilla Liman, on September 24, 1979. The country thus entered its 3rd republic, and many hoped the trauma was over.
The Armed Forces Revolutionary Council, during our short stay in power, have demonstrated openly what many people had only suspected before, namely, that the holding of office in government in this country had in almost all cases been used to plunder the wealth of the nation. Ghana is looking up to you. Thank you.
As President Liman took office, he inherited a populace both hopeful and fearful, a devastated economy, and a military still bristling with revolutionary zeal in its junior ranks. The AFRC had even sent many of its own firebrand members abroad for military education, partly to get them out of the way of the new government. Rawlings himself retreated into the background, for a time. However, the Liman administration struggled from the start. His People's National Party government faced Herculean economic problems. Ghana's coffers were empty, inflation raged, and essential supplies were still scarce. Early enthusiasm waned as Ghanaians saw little quick improvement in their living conditions. To make matters worse, some elements of the old political class crept back into influence, and whispers of corruption or mismanagement began to circulate. Rawlings grew disillusioned as he watched from the sidelines. He felt the civilian leaders were squandering the sacrifices of the revolution. In private, Rawlings and a group of loyalists began plotting a dramatic comeback. And on the last day of 1981, they struck again. Rawlings led a small band of soldiers to overthrow President Lamon's government, accusing it of corruption and incompetence. This time, he made it abundantly clear that he wasn't conducting another house-cleaning exercise. Following this, Rawlings assumed the mantle of national leader once more, now as the chairman of a new junta called the Provisional National Defense Council, the PNDC. With his boundless charisma, Rawlings stood at the forefront, becoming a galvanizing figure who could one day mingle shirtless with dock workers and farmers, and the next, descend from a military helicopter to address adoring crowds chanting his name. Truly, he cultivated the image of a dynamic man of the people, an image that reinforced his reputation as Junior Jesus in the eyes of supporters, a nickname students and workers had given him for his near-messianic appeal. But the reality of governance soon tempered the revolution's idealism. By mid-1982, the PNDC was strained by internal divisions. Left-wing members pushed for socialist policies and even courted support from the Eastern Bloc, while more pragmatic officials warned that Ghana was bankrupt and needed Western aid to stave off collapse. A severe drought and bushfires in 1983, coupled with the mass expulsion of over 1 million Ghanaian migrant workers from Nigeria, created an economic emergency. Amid this turmoil, Rawlings made a pivotal decision to embrace an IMF-backed structural adjustment program to revive Ghana's economy. State enterprises were privatized, government spending was slashed, and market reforms were implemented. This marked a sharp departure from the PNDC's initial socialist rhetoric and infuriated the hardline leftists in Rawlings' coalition, who felt betrayed.
How is it you had the nerve to go to the IMF when other African countries in dire shape didn't think they could take that chance?
I knew it would create problems for us, but did we have any other alternative? Whether it was a question of the IMF or World Bank or the Soviet Union didn't really make any difference. We were suffering from a very serious economic malaise, and we needed to do something about it. And wherever we could get some very basic resources from, to start rejuvenating the national infrastructure, to start rejuvenating, the national economy.
Brand new tractors. I'd like to come here in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years' time and see how many of these tractors will still be on road or, on the farms, functioning. What's going to be the lifespan of this expensive machine?
The early 1980s saw multiple coup attempts against the PNDC from various quarters, from disaffected leftists, disillusioned army officers, to supporters of the old Lamon regime. However, the most chilling challenge to Rawlings' legitimacy came in June 1982. On the night of June 30th, 1982, 3 high court judges and a retired army officer were abducted from their homes in Accra by a group of soldiers. They were driven in an army jeep to the Bundase military shooting range in the Accra Plains, where they were shot and murdered. In an attempt to cover up the crime and destroy evidence, the perpetrators doused the bodies in petrol and set them on fire. However, a heavy downpour that night partially extinguished the flames, leaving the charred remains to be discovered 3 days later by a farmer. This incident sent shockwaves throughout Ghana. Although Rawlings denied ordering these killings, many Ghanaians held his PNDC responsible for creating an atmosphere that enabled such lawlessness. Following a massive public outcry and pressure from the Ghana Bar Association and civil society, the PNDC government established a special investigations board to investigate the crime. Their investigation led to the identification and arrest of 5 primary suspects: Joachim Amarte Quay, a PNDC member; Lance Corporal Samuel K. Amadeka, Lance Corporal Michael Senya, Johnny Zandu, and Evans Tekpor Heckley. The 5 primary suspects were tried before a national public tribunal. During the trial in June 1983, Amadeka escaped from prison during a failed coup attempt and fled the country, remaining a fugitive to this day. The remaining 4 were found guilty and sentenced to death by firing squad in August 1983. Amarte Kwe, Johnny Zandu, and Michael Senya were executed, while Tekpor Heckley had already been executed earlier for his involvement in the failed coup. Subsequently, some key allies deserted Rawlings and the PNDC over this incident. Among those who resigned in protest was a young John Kufuor, a PNDC appointee who would later become president in 2001, and the Chief of Defense Staff, Brigadier Joseph Nunu Mensah. Despite these crises, Rawlings proved to be a shrewd survivor. He cracked down ruthlessly on dissent, detaining or forcing into exile both ultra-leftists and rival military officers who challenged him. You see, the PNDC regime was marked by repeated human rights abuses, political detainees held without trial, occasional executions of alleged plotters, and a relentless crackdown on press freedom. For most of the 1980s, Ghana experienced what was called a culture of silence, where fear kept open criticism of Rawlings to a minimum. However, by the late 1980s, Ghana's fortunes began to turn. The strict economic reforms, though painful, yielded results. Inflation was brought under control, industries revived, and Ghana earned praise from the World Bank as an African success story. Furthermore, Rawlings' government began to slowly mend fences with the international community. He distanced himself from his early alliances with Libya's Muammar Gaddafi and Cuba's Fidel Castro, and grew closer to Western leaders.
Some of the students we talked to said, he's a soft dictator. A dictator, but a soft dictator. Fair?
If I were, I wouldn't be as frustrated as I am.
But will people have a right to vote you out? And the party out?
I'm saying that we can vote people in and out. Personalities, okay? But my dear, what we need to do in this country is to establish a situation where even if it was the devil who should come and sit on top of us in Ghana, by virtue of certain procedures, certain practices, the devil cannot get away with doing whatever he wants. He would necessarily have to do what the people expect of him. I don't know if you appreciate what I'm talking about. So that Rawlings being here or out is not really important.
In the early 1990s, pressures mounted on the PNDC to democratize. The Cold War had ended, and multi-party democracy was sweeping across Africa. Perhaps recognizing the changing tides, Rawlings moved to transition Ghana back to constitutional governance. A new constitution was drafted, guaranteeing civil liberties and multi-party elections, and in 1992, Ghana's Fourth Republic was born. Rawlings, who resigned from the Air Force to run as a civilian, founded the National Democratic Congress Party and campaigned for president. Leveraging his populist credentials and the improvements in the economy, he won the November 1992 election, becoming the first president of the Fourth Republic. Many opposition figures, however, alleged that the elections had been tilted by Rawlings's incumbency and residual intimidation. Indeed, the main opposition boycotted the subsequent parliamentary polls, complaining of unfair conditions, leading to a virtually one-party parliament in Rawlings's first term. Nonetheless, Rawlings sought to legitimize his rule in the eyes of the world and history. He was re-elected in 1996 in a much more competitive election that observers judged largely free. As a civilian president, Rawlings surprised some by respecting certain constitutional limits. He tolerated a burgeoning private press, though not without occasional harassment of journalists, and allowed opposition activities, a far cry from the revolutionary tribunals of his earlier days. During this era, Ghana experienced relative stability and economic growth. The government invested in infrastructure, liberalized many sectors of the economy, and Ghana's cities saw a flourishing middle class. Before you know it, a new generation of Ghanaians came of age with no memory of the chaotic 1970s. But despite this, the shadow of Rawlings' past never fully disappeared. Political opponents frequently reminded the public of the violent excesses under Rawlings' watch. To his critics, he remained the man with blood on his hands, an ex-military strongman who had executed opponents and ruled by the gun. However, Rawlings himself remained deeply conscious of his image and legacy. As the year 2000 approached, Ghana prepared for a historic political moment. You see, the new democratic institution now in place had provided term limits, which meant Rawlings had to step down after serving 2 elected terms. In January 2001, the ex-flight lieutenant handed over the presidency to opposition leader John Rawlings, who had won the December 2000 elections. Indeed, Ghana in 2001 was at peace and on a path of regular elections, outcomes far from guaranteed when Rawlings first seized power. His legacy as a nation builder was acknowledged even by some skeptics, who conceded that Rawlings had presided over Ghana's turnaround from economic collapse to stability. In the years after leaving office, Rawlings remained an influential voice in Ghana. He took on statesman-like roles, such as serving as the African Union envoy to Somalia in the 2010s. However, on the 12th of November 2020, Jerry John Rawlings would pass away in Accra at the age of 73 after a short illness. The nation observed an official mourning period, and Rawlings was given a solemn state funeral in January 2021 with full military honors. Dignitaries from around the world attended, paying respects to a man who had come to embody Ghana's modern journey. During the funeral proceedings at Black Star Square in Accra, jets roared in a flypast, and cannons fired a 21-gun salute, a fitting tribute to the Air Force officer who had left such a mark on his country.